Chapter 1. First Signs. Richard Henderson had always prided himself on his ability to read people. 30 years as a detective in Millbrook had taught him to notice the subtle changes in behavior that others missed. But nothing in his career had prepared him for what he was witnessing in his own living room. His daughter Sarah sat hunched over her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be an endless stream of news articles. Her face reflected the blue glow of the screen, and her expression grew increasingly tense with each swipe. Across the room, his son-in-law Tom was doing the exact same thing, though Richard noticed they were no longer sharing what they found interesting with each other. "Did you see this story about the school board meeting?" Sarah finally spoke up, her voice carrying an edge Richard hadn't heard before. "Some parents are claiming that certain textbooks are being banned without proper discussion." Tom looked up from his device, his eyebrows furrowing. "That's funny, because I just read an article stating that parents are demanding more transparency in curriculum decisions. Seems like the same meeting, but completely different perspectives." Richard watched as the conversation that followed grew heated, with both his daughter and son-in-law citing different sources, different facts, and reaching completely opposite conclusions about what had happened at their local school. The strangest part was that both seemed equally convinced of their version of events. Later that evening, after Sarah and Tom had left, Richard found himself browsing the internet, trying to understand what his family members had been discussing. He searched for news about the school board meeting and was surprised to find dozens of articles, each presenting dramatically different interpretations of the same event. One headline read, "Local parents stand up against censorship." Another declared, "Community demands educational accountability." Yet another claimed, "School board faces unprecedented pressure." All were supposedly covering the same meeting Richard had attended himself just 2 weeks prior. The meeting, Richard remembered, had been relatively calm, with a few parents asking questions about reading materials and the board providing straightforward answers. There had been no dramatic confrontations, no heated debates, certainly nothing that warranted the inflammatory language he was seeing online. Intrigued by this discrepancy, Richard began exploring various social media platforms. He created accounts on several sites, using his real name and basic information. Within hours, his feeds began filling with content that seemed specifically designed to capture his attention. He noticed that the news stories appearing in his timeline often carried emotionally charged headlines. Articles about local politics were accompanied by dramatic photos and urgent-sounding language. Even mundane community events were presented as if they were matters of critical importance. Richard started keeping a notebook, documenting the patterns he observed. He noticed that similar stories would appear across different platforms at roughly the same times. The language used was often identical, suggesting the articles were being distributed from central sources rather than written independently by local journalists. One evening, while browsing a community forum, Richard encountered a discussion that caught his attention. Several users were sharing their observations about social media content, and some were making claims about deliberate manipulation of news feeds. "I'm telling you," wrote a user named TechSkeptic47. "These platforms are allegedly using sophisticated algorithms to determine what we see. Some reports suggest that content is specifically chosen to generate strong emotional responses." Another user, Concerned Citizen 22, responded, "I've noticed the same thing. Articles about the same events keep appearing, but they're all designed to make me angry or afraid. Some people are claiming this is intentional, though I can't prove it." Richard found himself drawn into this online community of individuals who were questioning what they were seeing in their digital environments. Many were regular people like himself, parents, retirees, small business owners, who had noticed unusual patterns in their social media experiences. Through these discussions, Richard learned about something called algorithmic curation. According to various online sources, social media platforms allegedly used complex mathematical formulas to decide which content appeared in users' feeds. Some reports claimed these algorithms were designed to maximize engagement by showing people content that would provoke strong reactions. The more Richard investigated, the more questions arose. If these claims were true, it could explain the dramatic shift in his family's dinner conversations. Perhaps they weren't naturally growing apart politically. Perhaps they were being shown different versions of reality, each designed to reinforce specific viewpoints. Richard decided to conduct a small experiment. He created several fake profiles with different political leanings and observed what types of content each account received. The results were startling. Conservative-leaning profiles were allegedly fed content that reinforced conservative viewpoints, while liberal profiles received information that supported liberal perspectives. Even more concerning was how quickly the algorithms seemed to identify and respond to user preferences. Within days of creating a profile, Richard would find his feed completely dominated by content that aligned with the political stance he had indicated during registration. As he documented these observations, Richard began to wonder if what he was witnessing represented something larger than simple marketing tactics. Could it be that the increasing polarization he had noticed in his community, in his family, and across the country was being artificially amplified by these digital systems? The questions kept multiplying, but the answers remained elusive. All Richard had were observations, patterns, and the nagging feeling that something fundamental had changed in how information was being distributed and consumed in his community. Chapter 2. Following the claims. Richard's investigation led him deeper into online communities where users shared theories about digital manipulation. He encountered individuals who claimed to have inside knowledge of how major technology platforms operated, though their identities remained anonymous and their claims were impossible to verify independently. One forum user, who went by the handle DeepCode, regularly posted what were allegedly leaked documents from various technology companies. These documents, if authentic, suggested the existence of projects with names like Algorithmic Freedom and Engagement Optimization Initiative. According to these purported leaks, some major platforms were allegedly running sophisticated programs designed to influence user behavior through carefully curated content delivery. The documents claimed that teams of behavioral psychologists and data scientists were working to maximize user engagement by triggering specific emotional responses. Richard approached these claims with the skepticism he had developed during his years in law enforcement. Anyone could create fake documents, and anonymous online sources were notoriously unreliable. However, the level of detail in these alleged leaks was impressive, including technical specifications and internal memos that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly. One document that particularly caught Richard's attention was supposedly an internal presentation titled Project Polarize, Maximizing User Retention Through Targeted Content Delivery. The document claimed that platforms had discovered users spent more time online when they were emotionally engaged, particularly when they were angry or anxious. According to this alleged presentation, algorithms were being designed to identify users' emotional triggers and then deliver content specifically calculated to activate those triggers. The goal, the document suggested, wasn't to inform users but to keep them scrolling, clicking, and engaging with the platform for as long as possible. Richard cross-referenced these claims with his own observations and found disturbing parallels. The patterns he had documented in his family's social media consumption aligned closely with what these leaked documents were describing. If the documents were authentic, they provided a possible explanation for the dramatic changes he had witnessed in his community. Other users in the forum shared similar experiences. A teacher named Janet reported that her students seemed increasingly unable to discuss controversial topics without becoming emotionally volatile. A small business owner named Marcus described how his customers had become more confrontational and suspicious, often citing news stories he couldn't find in mainstream sources. Richard began reaching out to these individuals privately, hoping to gather more first-hand accounts. What he discovered was a pattern of people who had noticed similar changes in their social environments, but had no framework for understanding what was happening. Through these conversations, Richard learned about other alleged projects and initiatives. Some users claimed that certain technology executives were deliberately working to increase social division as a means of maintaining user engagement and advertising revenue. Others suggested that the manipulation was more subtle, a byproduct of optimization algorithms that had learned to exploit human psychology without deliberate intent. The most disturbing claims involved allegations about timing and coordination. Some users reported that inflammatory content seemed to surge during important political events, elections, or social crises. The suggestion was that these weren't random occurrences, but carefully orchestrated campaigns designed to maximize social discord when the country was most vulnerable. Richard found testimonials from former technology employees who claimed to have witnessed internal discussions about user manipulation. These individuals, speaking anonymously, alleged that companies were fully aware of their platform's effects on social cohesion, but were reluctant to make changes that might reduce profitability. One particularly detailed account came from someone who claimed to have worked on algorithm development for a major social media platform. This person alleged that executives had received research showing how their algorithms were contributing to political polarization, but had chosen to suppress the findings rather than address the problem. According to this whistleblower, the company had allegedly discovered that politically moderate users were the least engaged with the platform. Users with strong political views, regardless of which direction they leaned, spent more time online and generated more advertising revenue. The natural business decision, the whistleblower claimed, was to push users toward more extreme positions. Richard compiled these accounts into a comprehensive report, but he remained acutely aware that he was dealing with unverified claims from anonymous sources. The alleged evidence was compelling, but it wouldn't stand up to the standards of proof he had been trained to require as a police officer. Still, the consistency of the reports and their alignment with his own observations convinced Richard that something significant was happening, even if the exact details remained unclear. He began to see his family's increasing political divisions not as natural developments, but as potential symptoms of a larger manipulation campaign. The question that haunted Richard was whether these claims represented genuine whistleblowing from concerned insiders or elaborate disinformation designed to create confusion and paranoia. In his experience, both scenarios were possible, and distinguishing between them would require evidence he wasn't sure he could obtain. Chapter 3, Seeking Truth. When Richard decided to share his findings with his family, the response was swift and unanimous. They thought he was losing his grip on reality. His daughter Sarah listened patiently as he explained his research, but her expression grew increasingly concerned as he continued. "Dad, you're starting to sound like one of those conspiracy theorists," she said gently. "I know retirement has been an adjustment, but maybe you should consider talking to someone professional about these ideas." His son-in-law Tom was more direct. "Richard, with all due respect, what you're describing sounds like paranoid thinking. These are just business platforms trying to show people content they'll find interesting. There's nothing sinister about it." Even his wife Margaret expressed worry. "Honey, you've been spending an awful lot of time on the computer lately. Some of the things you're saying, well, they sound like the kind of theories that upset people believe when they can't accept that the world is just complicated." Richard's attempts to show them the patterns he had documented were met with polite skepticism at best. When he presented the alleged leaked documents, his family dismissed them as obvious fabrications. When he explained the algorithmic manipulation he had observed, they suggested he was seeing patterns that didn't really exist. Frustrated but undeterred, Richard reached out to former colleagues in law enforcement. His old partner Detective James Sullivan agreed to meet for coffee, though he seemed reluctant to discuss Richard's research seriously. "Look, Rick, I've heard these kinds of theories before," James said, stirring his coffee absently. "Even if some of what you're saying is true, what exactly do you expect anyone to do about it? These tech companies have armies of lawyers and billions in resources. And honestly, most people seem pretty satisfied with their social media experience." Richard contacted several journalists, hoping to interest them in investigating his claims. Most never responded to his emails. Those who did were polite but dismissive, explaining that they would need much stronger evidence before pursuing such a controversial story. One journalist, Lisa Chun from the local newspaper, agreed to meet with Richard in person. She listened carefully to his presentation, but ultimately declined to write about his findings. "Mr. Henderson, I appreciate the work you've done, but I have to be honest with you," she said. "These claims would require extraordinary evidence to publish, and right now, all you have are anonymous online sources and personal observations. Our readers would see this as conspiracy theorizing, and it could damage our credibility." Richard's isolation grew as his pursuit of the truth pushed him further away from the people whose opinions mattered most to him. Friends and family began avoiding conversations with him, afraid he would launch into another explanation of algorithmic manipulation and social media conspiracy. The turning point came when Richard encountered Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a computer science professor at the nearby university. Unlike everyone else Richard had approached, Dr. Rodriguez didn't immediately dismiss his concerns. Instead, She invited him to her office to discuss his findings in detail. "What you're describing aligns with research some of my colleagues and I have been conducting," Dr. Rodriguez told him. "We've been studying algorithmic bias and content curation, and we've found evidence that supports some of your observations." Dr. Rodriguez showed Richard academic papers and research studies that documented similar patterns in social media behavior. While the research was more cautious in its language than the online claims Richard had encountered, it painted a picture of platforms that were indeed designed to maximize engagement through emotional manipulation. "The question isn't whether this is happening," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "The question is whether it's happening intentionally or as an unintended consequence of optimization algorithms. Both scenarios are problematic, but they require different solutions." Working with Dr. Rodriguez, Richard began to refine his understanding of the issues he had been investigating. Rather than focusing on specific conspiracy theories or alleged leaked documents, they concentrated on documented patterns of algorithmic behavior and their measurable effects on user engagement and political polarization. Their collaboration produced a more nuanced picture of the situation. Some of the most dramatic claims Richard had encountered online appeared to be exaggerations or fabrications. However, the core issue, that social media algorithms were contributing to increased political polarization and social division, was supported by academic research and documented evidence. Dr. Rodriguez helped Richard understand that the truth was likely more complex than either his family's dismissive attitude or the conspiracy theories he had found online. The platforms weren't necessarily engaged in deliberate manipulation for political purposes, but their business models created incentives that had similar effects. "The algorithms aren't trying to destroy democracy," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "They're trying to maximize user engagement and advertising revenue. But the techniques that work best for those goals happen to be the same techniques that increase polarization and social division." As Richard and Dr. Rodriguez prepared to publish their findings in an academic journal, they faced the same skepticism Richard had encountered elsewhere. Some reviewers praised their methodology, but questioned whether their conclusions were too speculative. Others worried that publishing the research might contribute to public paranoia about technology platforms. The final version of their paper was careful to distinguish between documented facts and unverified claims. They presented evidence that algorithmic content curation was contributing to political polarization, but they avoided making specific accusations against individual companies or executives. Even with these precautions, the paper generated controversy when it was published. Some readers praised it as important research that shed light on a critical social issue. Others dismissed it as academic speculation that fed into harmful conspiracy theories about technology companies. Richard found himself in an uncomfortable position. He had succeeded in documenting real problems with social media algorithms and their effects on society. However, he hadn't found the clear-cut evidence of deliberate manipulation that would satisfy skeptics or provide a basis for concrete action. The questions that had started his investigation remained largely unanswered. Were algorithms deliberately designed to polarize society, or were the divisive effects an unintended consequence of profit-maximizing behavior? Were the leaked documents he had encountered authentic whistleblowing or sophisticated disinformation? Was the increasing polarization in his community primarily driven by algorithmic manipulation, or were other social and political factors more important? As Richard reflected on his journey, he realized that the truth was probably more complex than any simple answer could capture. The algorithms were likely contributing to social division, but they weren't the only factor. Some platforms might be more responsible than others, but proving deliberate misconduct would require evidence that remained elusive. What Richard had learned was that asking these questions was itself important, even if definitive answers remained out of reach. The very act of investigating and documenting these issues had helped him understand his family's changing dynamics and his community's increasing polarization in new ways. The story ended not with clear resolution, but with continued uncertainty. Richard had found evidence that algorithms were affecting social cohesion, but he couldn't prove whether this was happening by design or by accident. His family remained skeptical of his conclusions, though they had begun to pay more attention to their own social media consumption. The fundamental question Richard had uncovered, whether digital platforms were shaping society in ways their users didn't understand, remained open. The answer would require ongoing investigation, public debate, and perhaps most importantly, individual awareness of how these systems might be influencing personal beliefs and relationships. Richard's investigation had raised more questions than it answered, but perhaps that was exactly what was needed. In a world where certainty was increasingly rare, the ability to ask the right questions might be more valuable than having all the answers.